Hello and welcome to another episode of the Wise Guys podcast with Matt Louie and Lenny C, where we talk about proverbs and other topics and try to grow in wisdom. Lenny, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really good. Today we're going to be talking about not Proverbs, but a similar related topic, Ecclesiastes, and what Ecclesiastes has to say about wisdom. It's kind of like an interesting book. I don't know if you've ever read it, Matt.
In fact, I have.
Well, probably in preparation for this. But before this, I didn't really ever study Ecclesiastes. Actually, the topic came to mind because my wife, May Win, she's actually doing a Bible study through Ecclesiastes with a friend, and she has told me, "Oh, there's some stuff about wisdom in it." And I was like, "Oh, really? What is it?" And she shared with me, and I was like, "Hey, maybe we should chat about this with Matt and the Wise Guys." So here we are.
Yeah. So a little bit of inside info. Lenny, when you approached me last time we talked with brainstorming topics for this episode, and you brought up the topic of Ecclesiastes and you shared that story, I read through some of those verses and I was just really excited to dive in because on the surface it seems to be saying, and we'll get into this, that the pursuit of wisdom or wisdom, which Solomon touts in the book of Proverbs, seems to be in a way meaningless or chasing after the wind, along with the theme of Ecclesiastes. And so, what does that really mean? And I was just excited, and I'm sure you've gone through a lot of the same things, and just studying the background of the book. What is its message, its structure, and things like that. There's a lot of interesting things, especially when you compare it to Proverbs. So I'm excited to just chat about it and see what you found. But
Yeah.
I guess just to kick things off, what verse are we talking about? Do you remember the part in chapter 1?
Yeah, Ecclesiastes 1:18. I think that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, let's start actually in verse 16. Let's read from 16 to 18 just to give the context.
Hmm.
I'll go ahead and read it. It says, I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. And I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realized that this also is striving after wind, because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. And when you first read that, it seems like the opposite of what we've been reading in Proverbs.
Yeah.
Because in Proverbs, it's all positive things about wisdom. How when you increase in wisdom, it's not grief or pain or vexation, but it's benefits and blessings that you get from it. So what is this text saying, and why is it the opposite of what Proverbs is saying? And what does it actually mean? So
Yeah.
I'm super excited to just chat. Maybe we won't be able to plumb all the depths of the entire book and everything in this short chat, but I'm curious, what if you found, maybe starting with the overall background of Ecclesiastes, like the author, what's the structure, anything about that would help?
Yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up because the author, I mean, I think in doing research about this, like most people would say that or agree that the author is actually Solomon, and is the same author of Proverbs. And it's interesting because on one hand in Proverbs, like you said, he says all these good things about wisdom. Like he's like the wisest man on earth, like who ever lived. And he, says all these insightful thoughts about wisdom. And then if you read Ecclesiastes, at least for most of Ecclesiastes, you kind of walk away thinking, wow, like wisdom is pain. Wisdom is, in a different version, says it's vexation. It's troubling to the spirit. And in fact, like it's almost as if there's no gain in wisdom. Like, so why even try? Why even do anything? Because
Yeah.
everything is just like worthless.
Right. So there is that seeming perspective given in Ecclesiastes. I think that, like you said, there is a view that Ecclesiastes is written by Solomon because there are a lot of clues within the text, such as the one we read. He is the one who had more wisdom than anyone else, and he wrote and collected a bunch of proverbs and sayings. And there's some uh, clues throughout the text that he seems to fit the description, although it doesn't say
Hmm.
Solomon. It says the words of the preacher. So I think there are some scholars that kind of leave it a little bit more open as to whether it was written by Solomon in his lifetime or by a someone that came after Solomon but had a lot of the same perspectives. Also, I think it's important to point out there is an interpretation of this where, if you notice in the beginning of the book and at the end, it's a third person narrator that is
Mm-hmm.
then uh,
Inputted.
presenting
Yeah.
the sayings of someone in the middle of the brackets. So, for instance, in verse 1, it says, "The words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem." And then it goes on to say all the words. And then at the end of the book, uh, it says, "In addition to being a wise man, the preacher also taught the people knowledge," etc. So he's speaking in the third person, and presenting the view of this Solomon like person or Solomon himself, and his pursuits of wisdom and pleasure and things like that. Or it could be, I think another interpretation is that, yeah, Solomon, Solomon or the preacher wrote the entire book and just referred to himself in the introduction and the conclusion in the third person, just as a literary device to introduce and conclude the book. But I think that just tells you the struggles that some people have in interpreting and understanding this book, because, like you
Hmm.
said, and like we read, there are portions of it that seem um, sort of negative, like having a negative outlook or jaded or cynical view on life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where, especially in the beginning parts, where whether it's wisdom or labor or pleasure or different things that people really pursue, right? If you think about it, people that may not have a Christian background, they may pursue work and labor and riches and pleasure. And there's the experience that we all have where we can relate to this author, where it's at the end of the day, it kind of seems meaningless or kind of seems empty, because once you obtain the thing, then it doesn't seem to really satisfy you. You want something else, or maybe you lose it, or maybe time and chance happen and you work your whole life to build up all these riches and your son or your daughter squanders it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But from also the wisdom perspective, you can weary your life to gain all this wisdom and live in a certain way, and things can just happen that randomly mess everything up. And I think some of us can relate to that too, when we put too much emphasis on, okay, here's how the world should work, all this cause and effect. I can understand everything perfectly. Well, if you live long enough, like Solomon or the preacher says, like you'll experience that it doesn't always work out in accordance to what you thought, even if you are the most wise person.
Yeah.
And then, but I think by the end of the book, it becomes a little bit more clear that it's not just about vanity or just that everything is meaningless. There is some things that he concludes from living his life and exploring all these things. And it's kind of surprising to me because, again, it's not what you would necessarily expect,
Hmm.
coming from someone who wrote Proverbs or from that same perspective, but it serves as sort of a balancing or counterweight to some of the things that, if you were to just read the book of Proverbs and, in fact, zooming out even further in these wisdom literature books in the Old Testament, there's Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, um, Job, and some could also put Song of Solomon in that category. They tend to highlight different facets of life, where Proverbs is more, these things are black and white and these things are cause and effect, and general principles that are true, which is why it's called Proverbs. For instance, the book of Job shows sometimes life doesn't work out the way that it should, and what happens when that happens. And then I think Ecclesiastes is also kind of along that same vein, showing some of the just being in contrast to Proverbs, showing that life doesn't always work out a certain way.
Yeah. Actually, like you said, towards the end of the book, and he kind of peppers it throughout the book. He pretty much says like even though all these bad things can happen, and even though like to the righteous, the deeds of the wicked will happen to the righteous. Like you'll get punished for all these things. Even though he says that, like he says, but take joy in what God has provided to you. Like take joy in the little things and like celebrate and be with your family and be happy with what you have. And then
Yeah,
towards the end, like it's so interesting. Like he just says he basically just gives a purpose to all of this seemingly uh, purposeless kind of pain and strife and toil for nothing. He says, fear God and obey his commandments. And he just kind of wraps it up. And initially when I read that, I was like, wow, so you're telling me that God, like causes all this pain and you're just telling me to just fear him? And that was like my initial takeaway. I was like, no. There's a deeper purpose to this. Like God has intended all these things to happen for his will, and it's our our duty as man before God to fear him and to like lay our hearts prostrate to his will, and to know that like these blessings that he gives us, that we're supposed to enjoy them, to praise him, and to be on his provision, but also at the same time be in awe and uh, be in awe of his wisdom in allowing his entire will to happen to us, whether it's seemingly good or seemingly bad for us.
yeah, yeah. And I think it should also be noted that throughout the book, he does still say that wisdom is better than
Mm.
folly, right?
Yeah.
So it's almost like he talks about a lot of things that he pursued in trying to find meaning in life, whether it's pleasure or possessions or work and things like that, and even wisdom and folly. And he says that wisdom is better. And even there's a section in the book that kind of is like Proverbs, right? In chapter 7, it's just a bunch of Proverbs. And he is still saying that wisdom is, of course, better than living foolishly. But from an even more broad perspective, if that's all you focus on and try to find meaning in even just that, apart from fearing God, then it is ultimately striving after
Vanity.
wind
Yeah.
or vanity. Um, and yeah, I think it was really interesting to me that at the end of the book, there's a lot of uh, verses that talk about, like you said, just enjoying life,
Mm.
especially while you're young, just enjoying. I mean, this verse seems bizarre too. In chapter 11, verse 9, it says, "Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of young manhood, and follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things." So it seems not like what you would hear from someone at church, right? Just like
Yeah.
enjoy life, like follow whatever impulses of your heart. And then also the second half of it's kind of odd in that context, yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. But I think when understood in the context of the last couple of verses which you quoted about fearing God, it's just saying enjoy life in moderation, especially while you're young and you have all these blessings and energy and health to enjoy them. But know that God will bring you to account for everything that you do. So live your life in fear of Him, and that ultimately is the best that you could hope for as far as being human and finding meaning and purpose in your life.
Do
Don't
you,
try to just seek it in um, things, experiences, and even just pursuing wisdom. in and of itself. I think in the end, he even writes about that. He says, just before the end, beyond this, my son, be warned. The writing of many books is endless, and excessive devotion books is wearying to the body. So moderation, I think, is kind of the message there.
Do you think that that
And
young man verse is a warning or an encouragement?
the one that we talked about with rejoice and enjoy life, yet know
Yeah.
that God will bring. Yes, I think it's both. I think it's encouragement to maybe not take life too seriously, which I think something I need to hear. Just I think what it's saying is that you can enjoy life and smell the roses and enjoy things God has given you, while staying sober minded and knowing that God is ultimately the judge, and he'll weigh everything that you do. And like Jesus said, every careless word that people speak, they will give an account for. So just balancing that gravity with levity, just being able to live life and enjoy it. I think alternatively, we might need to hear one half of that or the other, depending on how we tend to, depending on our disposition.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. Like, I feel like, I mean, just to tie it back to the original verse that we had talked about, how for in much wisdom there's much vexation. I think like with a lot of knowledge, and Maywin discussed this with me. I thought this was so interesting. Like when we take life too seriously, like we start wondering a lot of things. Like for instance, why did this like strife or trial happen to me? Like what did God like intend for me to learn from this? And oftentimes like yeah, sometimes we'll take away like oh, we need to be more humble. Oh, I need to have more patience. And those trials help elucidate like sinful nature, the sinful nature of our hearts, right? But other times like sometimes you just can't find like a specific answer and you just kind of conclude, well, it's because of my sinful nature that I, went through this trial, or because of someone else's sinful nature that, I went through this trial. And when we take life too seriously, we just think like, oh man, like if you think of like David, right? Like he was like a righteous man, and yet he was put through so much strife. Like people were trying to kill him, like enemies surrounded him, but yet God delivered him from all these things, right? Like why, why, like why? That's just what goes through my head, and I think as we just like progress through life, as we learn and we strive for wisdom and knowledge, I think we just become, I think in a sense, more cynical. Like I think there's something to be said about having a childlike faith when you're a child, and when you grow up and you learn about the world and how unrighteous it is and how sinful it is and how prone man is to sin against one another. You're like, maybe the world isn't that good, maybe I should think about my faith even more. And I think that's like what he's kind of like pointing out here. When you have more wisdom, when you have more knowledge, there's much vexation, because you realize in the context of the world, like people are just so sinful, and that's part of your gaining wisdom, which I thought was like really interesting.
Yeah, so I think I think when we narrow it down to what that verse is saying, it's like there's a saying in our language that ignorance is bliss, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like the younger child doesn't have as many cares in the world, but when they grow and they become wiser and older, which is not necessarily a bad thing, it's actually a good thing. There are just more cares and worries, and then I think we're called, like you said, to by the end of the book, we're called to return to that childlike state where we're not trying so hard to find the meaning behind everything, right? And we're just back to the being someone who enjoys life, enjoys the good gifts that God has given, and fears God and keeps His commandments. And I think what you were saying there is like it's a good reminder. I think I certainly find myself trying to assign too much meaning or like assign too much of my mental and emotional state to circumstances or events that happen in my life or
Mm.
my job, my friends, my family, my identity, these things. It seems like it's everything to me, right? Like if I, for instance, if I don't get this thing that I want or be in this thing that I want, then that's then
Why?
my life is meaningless or
Yeah.
it's empty. But I think this is
Yeah.
a good reminder to not try to think that your meaning or your purpose is tied to doing a certain thing, having a certain experience, like being in a certain relationship. um, yes, those things are all important, and we should strive for them. Just remember that life is fleeting, that God will eventually bring everything to account. And the best you could do is fear God and keep his commandments, and just remember to enjoy the gifts that he's given you. And don't have to think that everything has, um, you don't have to assign too much meaning. And I think
Mm.
like this is a good thing for us to be reminded of, as especially as we keep going through Proverbs um, and trying to apply it in our lives and trying to understand them. Like at the end of the day, let's not lose sight of the fact that there are going to be things that we don't understand in life. There are going to be times when we have done the best that we can and tried to live according to wisdom as much as we could, and it's still the outcome won't make sense.
Yeah.
And I think the book of Job and Ecclesiastes really teaches that well, and we do well to keep it in mind as we keep going through Proverbs.
Yeah. Just to wrap it up, what have you guys been thinking about? Have you read Ecclesiastes before, and have you come to similar conclusions? How do you think that kind of contrasts with what we've been talking about in Proverbs? If you've been following along, and we'd love to hear from you. If you want to reach us, you can always comment below, or we also have a Twitter, obviously on YouTube, on Spotify, and Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Matt, it was a great time just chatting with you, going through Ecclesiastes. I've learned a lot. I'm sure you've learned a lot as well.
Yeah, likewise. Really happy, and just keep the questions coming for those who are listening to us. We really appreciate it. Any way you can interact with us, it really helps. So thank you for giving us your questions, and thanks for listening.